Hello, welcome to Midwives, a Metro Midwifery podcast. I'm Gina Gerboth.
And I'm Nedra Hale, and we are home birth midwives serving the Denver metro area.
So for today's topic, we are going to talk about consent, choice, and shared decision-making.
This is a really interesting topic. Those of us that may have started in childbirth work in the 90s and early 2000s, like us, might remember that it used to be kind of like the gold standard to talk about informed consent.
Yeah.
And we just talked about it all the time. Informed consent. And basically now we're realizing, and you're going to get into the nitty gritty of this, but we're realizing that, one, to state it simply, that's not enough.
Yeah.
But we're really, what we were teaching is how to be informed about what you're agreeing to.
Right.
But there wasn't a lot of choice.
Right.
Choice is
right.
key, as it turns
it's
out.
A pretty loaded term when you think about it, informed consent. I mean, there's a presupposition that you're going to consent.
Right. It's part of the thing.
Yeah.
So, as midwives and as people who are speaking with midwifery clients all the time, we do feel that having autonomy and care is really important. And so I think it's really interesting to go back and review how we talk about these things and make sure that we're actually tackling the autonomy and the choice part properly.
Yeah. And even kind of taking it a step back, and, autonomy gets thrown around as a buzzword, but it's really an essential medical ethical principle of medical ethics. So it's an essential part of providing ethical care.
Yes.
So it's not just something nice to do because you want to be agreeable.
Right. I mean, a person should be making their own choices about healthcare, and they should be informed.
Yeah.
They should have the tools they need to make those choices.
Yeah. So I'll just kind of quickly go over, there's many principles of medical ethics, but the four kind of big ones that we talk a lot about are beneficence, which is, doing your best, non-maleficence, which is doing no harm, justice, which is making sure that all people have access to appropriate care, and then, of course, autonomy is the one that we're kind of talking about today.
Yes.
And that's the ability to make your own decisions.
Right.
I mean, that's just like, it seems like 101, but it's actually kind of, this is a developing field.
Right.
So, yeah. So I would agree with you. It started with informed consent. Or actually, it kind of started before that. Informed consent probably came on
Informed consent, it's been so long now since we started, but I felt like when we were coming at it in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a response to the paternalistic medicine model. And maybe it had started before then, and I am not aware of it, but it seemed like this is what we're doing. We're like pushing back against this pat you on the head and tell you what we're going to do model. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and really, if you think about it in the kind of post-World War II era, the way that people were treated in childbirth was like paternalistic is the perfect word for it. Just absolutely treated like children.
Right.
And given no decision-making authority or not even told what was going to happen.
Right.
And separated from support people.
Yes.
So, it was not that recently or that long ago that having your spouse or partner with you
oh my goodness,
in childbirth was a kind of an assumption. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so there's this pushback then against this doctor knows best mentality. Right. And that is when I think the informed consent started to kind of come onto the scene.
Yes.
So informed consent was kind of like, you have a problem, you need a treatment, here's some risks and potential complications. there's not necessarily a choice or options involved with this decision making, but at least we're thinking maybe we better tell you
Yes.
a little about what we're doing.
Right. Maybe you should know what is happening.
Yeah. And I don't really know, I don't think we should get too in depth, but certainly you get a kind of a blanket consent form when you go into the hospital, even in childbirth, and kind of a consent to treat.
Right.
Up a little bit.
Right. And I remember that too, where we are now, we can turn down whatever this is, that maybe we'll use episiotomy as an example, that this is what episiotomy is. They explain the procedure and then you decline the procedure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's, at least ostensibly, there's not an assumption that you're going to accept the treatment, that you're making a decision here.
Right.
And that you can refuse the offer of treatment.
Right. So that's where I bet this is where we got into the, I hate this word, but there's this word that people use called non-compliant.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I bet you're right.
Yes.
You can get labeled as non-compliant.
So we've got all these natural birth people refusing the things, and now they're non-compliant.
All the things.
Yes.
I was going to say too, I think that even though it's there as a theoretical thing to refuse, there can still be some coercion involved.
Oh, certainly.
So I've heard many people say, well, if you don't do this, we'll report you to CPS.
Yes, if you don't do this horrible thing will happen.
Your baby will die. Your baby will die.
Your baby will die.
I mean, that was not thrown around infrequently.
Oh, no. I mean, that was told to me
dozens of times.
Even though I have, waxed poetic about my beautiful hospital birth, that exact thing happened to me the day after my beautiful hospital birth, that I wanted to decline a routine procedure and was told that my baby would die if I didn't do it. So, it wasn't all the way perfect.
And sometimes this is all really, I don't know what the word is, lost. There's no discussion about the magnitude of risk. And so, sure, your baby could die. Sure, your baby could die when you leave the hospital and go home.
Yes.
In a car accident.
Yes.
So, this... there's no comparison or no context given for what the actual chances are. And that's very coercive. It's very coercive.
It's just a scare tactic. And yes, I mean, there are risks to accepting or declining anything, right? And so what we need is information.
Yeah, so then I think our next iteration of this model is the informed choice model. And in the informed choice model, you're usually given more than one option and possibly given some support around how to make this decision.
Okay.
So have you ever heard of the BRAIN acronym?
I am just learning about this. I don't know how this slipped past me, but
I don't know when I first heard about it. Maybe the doula training I did years and years ago. I'm not sure. But it's sort of an acronym, to remember some questions that you can ask. When something is presented to you that you're not sure about, you can ask some questions. So the B stands for benefits. What are the benefits to this procedure? So I like to use amniotomy for this example because it's a fairly neutral topic.
Okay.
So somebody offers, well, we could break your water. So you could ask, what are the benefits?
Okay.
And then R is, of course, the risks.
Right.
What are the risks? And I would say that if this is a good discussion, they're giving you some data.
Yes.
So not just you could have a cord prolapse and your baby could die.
Right. You would be, the likelihood of this happening is X.
Right. Exactly. Okay. A is alternatives. What are alternatives? So this would depend on why they were suggesting it. Like maybe your labor's kind of seems like it's stalled out a little bit.
Right.
Would you like me to break your water? So you could say, what would be some alternatives?
Yeah.
And then ask for that. You could even suggest some alternatives. Could I do nipple stimulation? Could I do, could I go walk the stairs?
Right.
I is intuition. It's so funny because I double checked this today and I don't remember I being intuition. So I don't know when it changed. I feel like it has morphed over time.
The rest of this so far is something that I would teach in my Bradley classes, but it wasn't under the brain.
I have heard brain, so maybe I is just a newer.
Yeah, it was, benefits, risks, alternatives, and maybe it was just what if we
don't do anything.
What if we don't do anything? So tell me about the intuition.
I think it's just what is your gut telling you.
Okay.
Well, kind of what sort of seems like the most sensible approach for you.
Okay.
And then in is nothing. What if we do nothing?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So informed choice is still used a lot. I still see it.
Yes.
I feel like this is happening more frequently in more progressive settings. For example, a hospital that's a little more progressive. Yeah. I do see these conversations happening. And I think it's good. I think it's movement in the right direction.
Informed choice, I think, is lovely. I think that's a marvelous approach.
Yeah. And then now what we're really wanting to talk to you about today is shared decision making, which is really, I think, the evolution of this process.
Okay.
So shared decision making I'm sure that it wasn't developed at the University of Ottawa, but it's really, the University of Ottawa has provided a lot of tools for this process, and so they're really kind of famous for it, for lack of a better word. And they have a specific tool called the Ottawa Shared Decision-Making Tool or Guide. And all that shared decision-making does, that is a little different than informed choice, is that it helps provide support to the client or patient for making this decision. Mm-hmm. It usually offers 3 options. So usually doing nothing is one of the options.
Okay.
So it kind of presents them sort of side by side.
But
not
it
always.
Takes it more into an in-depth way to kind of map out all of the risks and benefits. And
the tool is actually what you could call a graphical organizer that allows you to kind of see things next to each other. And then a really critical piece of the shared decision-making process is to talk about the client's values, because no 2 people, when given the same information, are going to make the same decision.
Right.
And we have talked about this. Mm-hmm. What would you do if? So, for example, when I had my babies, we didn't screen for GBS at home.
Right.
And in fact, I don't even think my first baby in the hospital was screened for GBS, which is Group B strep, which is a very common practice in the United States.
Yes.
Universal screening. And ultimately, the bottom line is, if you have Group B strep, you're planning a hospital birth in the United States, the standard of care is to get IV penicillin as treatment. Mm-hmm. And so I know you and I have talked about, well, what if you were having a hospital birth? And this isn't, by the way, something that direct entry midwives in Colorado offer. Right. So that changes the context of the decision making.
Exactly.
But if you were planning a hospital birth, what would you do? And I know you've said.
I have said that I would most likely want to be treated with antibiotics.
Yeah.
And I mean, thankfully, I've always screened negative, so I haven't had to
So you did get screened. Yeah. So your children are just slightly younger.
Yeah. So it's.
Or it was maybe they were a little more ahead of the curve in Arizona. They might have just been
geographical.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But, so I haven't actually had to make the choice. But I've always thought that I would want to be treated. And so then it's so interesting when we are so like-minded about so many things, and then we have this discussion. And by the way, your viewpoint is very compelling, when we're talking about the effect of these broad spectrum antibiotics on our gut flora and all that stuff.
Right.
It's super compelling.
But all of that being said, you can only make the decision based on kind of what feels like the right decision at the time. If you had a heavy colonization, I certainly, if I knew my baby was going to be impacted by this, of course I would do the antibiotics instead of
it's all
direct treatment of the baby.
Some more information gathering or something.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you can be in different places at different times.
Yes.
So the point is that there isn't a right or wrong answer. Mm-hmm. That different people are going to get the same information and come to a different decision.
Right.
With absolute rational decision-making practices.
Yeah, and it may be that the healthcare provider doesn't agree with the decision, thinks it's the wrong decision, thinks it's an irresponsible decision even, but in the end it still needs to be the patient's choice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So and so it takes that client value system, and we're going to go through the process here in a minute, but it takes that into deeper consideration. It also takes into consideration who else is making this decision with you.
Right.
So that's a really hot topic too.
It is.
Because I think we hear it a lot with home birth. Oh, I would love to have a home birth, but my husband doesn't want to have one.
Right.
That happens really, really frequently.
It does.
And so this could be a tool for them to kind of work this out.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, bottom line is that there is more responsibility placed on the patient or client.
Yes.
And so that is what some people want and what some people don't.
Right. And I think it comes back, let's say I was reading this really interesting article about it today that, basically boiling it down to this one specific point. What if the patient's choice is that they want their physician to make the choice decision for them?
And it's on the tool. What do you
it?
want your role to be in this decision making?
Oh.
And that's absolutely an option to let your provider make the choice for you. I personally am not comfortable with that as the provider.
No.
Not only as the client, but as the provider. Yeah. I don't want to say you should do this or shouldn't do that. That's too much responsibility on me.
Yes, but what we can say is...
I would recommend.
This is what I recommend. This is an example of a similar choice that I have made for myself, something like
when
that.
You weigh the evidence, there seems to be, in favor of doing it this way. I also want to say that this does not mean that the client gets to have all the options available to them. So, for example, in Colorado, we are not authorized to attend vaginal breech births at home.
Right.
So if you have a breech baby and you're going through this decision-making process, one of the choices may not be to continue with your current care provider because we might have limitations.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, the healthcare provider also has choice.
Exactly.
If we do not feel comfortable participating in something, it's our choice to not do that.
And it's so funny because one of my midwives, when my children when I was pregnant and seeing a midwife, she used to say really funny things like, you can do whatever you want except sacrifice your baby.
Oh my gosh. What?
Weirdest thing to say. But I actually, as a provider, don't feel that way. There are certain things that if you can do whatever you want, but that doesn't impact what I choose to do.
Yes.
So breech birth is a good example. Going past 42 weeks is a good example. And these aren't always our personal preferences.
Right.
Sometimes we have restrictions based on our licensing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true for other types of healthcare providers too, that it's we can't be forced to go outside of our safety protocols.
Yeah.
And that, so there may come
That's part of our clinical judgment.
When the patient might decide to go with somebody else.
Right. And that's completely legitimate. And it is our job to give them the information so that they can make that decision and support them in that decision. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't mean that our role ends. It just means that it might not be what they would wish the option to be.
So what about if we're not talking about, I don't mean to veer off the path here, but what if it's not safety? What if it is just a philosophical difference?
Mm-hmm. Do you have an example?
Let's say a midwife, because we're midwives. Let's say a midwife does not support a particular type of testing or procedure. Mm-hmm. I'm going to say ultrasound. Mm-hmm. And that midwife's preference is this. They don't like ultrasound. Mm-hmm. The client wants to have access to an ultrasound. How does that change the conversation? Because it's kind of backwards. But I've heard of many of these kinds of situations where like provider bias is involved in the opposite way of what you would think.
Yeah, I would say that if this practitioner, this midwife, is engaging in shared decision making, they have a responsibility to provide current peer-reviewed evidence that talks about the risks and benefits of each option. So getting an ultrasound, not getting an ultrasound, getting an ultrasound in the first trimester, getting one in the second trimester, kind of whatever the options are that we're talking about. They do have a responsibility to provide information. And in my opinion, there's an ethical, so responsibility is too big of a word. There's an ethical obligation to support the client in being able to access the option that they want.
Okay.
So I would call it ethical.
Yes.
Because it can be really hard to just say. So one of the biggest cop-outs I hear, not to use a really loaded term, is when midwives say, well, go do your research and let me know what you decide.
Oh, yes.
I think that is completely irresponsible. There is so much conflicting information out there.
Yes.
And
old information, scary information.
Completely not backed up by evidence. So I just have a knee-jerk reaction to that. I just don't like it when people say that. I mean, do they think their clients aren't going to go Google it? Of course they're going to Google it. But we have to also give them, we have to go through the research and the literature ourselves and kind of cultivate, kind of help figure out what's most relevant in this situation for this client.
It's our responsibility to come to the table with the current information.
Yeah.
Right. And it is a balancing act, I think, to have that information and not be coercive with the information.
Yes.
So it's an art, and you have to constantly practice that art. But we should have the information readily available. And yes, of course, the client or the patient should also do their own research, but it should be with a foundation that is already there, you know, not just sent out.
Right. Go do your research. Yes. Well, a good example is actually we just did our newborn screening podcast this week, or this last week. And the conversation that I saw in the Facebook group that said, my midwife said I don't need it. So that's that's not one of those things that you can just easily access in the appropriate time frame. So in my opinion, that midwife has a responsibility to give good information about the test, the pros and cons and risks and benefits.
Yes.
And if that client decides they want it, to help arrange that. Because it's almost impossible to get especially the blood spot screen and the CCHD screening in the first 24 to 48 hours if somebody hasn't arranged that.
Yeah, we have to get it arranged.
So that's what I would say. And just like that example, that's not shared decision making. When somebody says you don't need this, you shouldn't get this, it's not necessary, that is not shared decision making.
Right.
Everybody's going to come to a different decision.
That's tough. It's tough because, we depending on what field you're in, of course it's going to be different, but we need to be on top of what is the standard in that field and make sure that those options are being presented. And
like you said, and being attentive to the balance of providing information that's not biased, making a recommendation that's not coercive, kind of finding that delicate balance.
Yes.
So this Ottawa Shared Decision-Making tool, which will be available for you on the blog post for the week, you can, I think, you'll be able to download it. If you can't download it, I'll figure out a way to link to something that you can download. But it is just a nice little useful worksheet that you can fill out when you're trying to make any decision. So it starts off with, what decision are you making? So should we come up with an example? That would be a good one.
I am going to be making a decision about first trimester chromosome screening.
Okay. The non-invasive prenatal testing one.
Yes.
Okay. Free cell DNA.
Okay.
Okay. So you want to decide if you should do this.
Yes.
When does this decision need to be made?
It needs to be made within 2 weeks. Right. That's when my next appointment is.
Okay. Great. Why do you need to make this decision?
I'm getting a little bit older. It's more likely maybe I've heard to become an issue in my life.
Okay. So what stage of the decision making are you in? I haven't thought about it. I'm thinking about it. I'm close to making a decision. I've made a decision.
I am thinking about it.
Okay. That's a great place to do this tool, because if you've made a decision, we can just be done.
Yes.
So usually we will offer a few options. So one would be the non-invasive prenatal test, the free cell DNA. Another one could be, we could also offer that you could do the maternal serum AFP,
Okay.
or you could do nothing.
Okay.
So maybe we're giving you 3
options.
choices. Okay. So here's where I think the midwife really has more responsibility. But if your provider isn't engaging in this, you might have to take on more of this yourself. But you go through and you kind of search the literature and search the good resources to figure out what the benefits and pros are of each option and the risks and cons of each option. And because this is a pretty complicated issue, we won't necessarily go into them.
I picked one that was kind of
a little
hard
complicated.
It's
okay.
A little nuanced. Sorry.
It's okay. And so then kind of like you kind of take this, it looks like a table you'll see on the tool. Mm-hmm. You kind of start looking at it, kind of like you said, graphically, like allowing you to kind of see it.
There's literally a little chart here. What are the benefits or the pros to each option? What are the risks or the cons to each
and
option?
That language is important because some things would have pros and cons, but not necessarily benefits and risks. So, for example, place of birth. If you're deciding between home birth center or hospital, we're not talking about benefits and risks as much as we're talking about pros and cons. Yes, there are benefits and risks, but it's more about which pros and cons work for you. So just kind of at a glance, which option do you prefer? 1, 2, 3, or you're not sure yet?
I'm going to go with not sure yet.
Okay, so we're going to keep going. So then we're going to talk about who is supporting you. Who else is involved in making this decision?
Well, I am a single mother, so I guess it's just me.
Okay. So in this case, they don't necessarily have a preferred option. But if you were partnered, they would probably have a preferred option. And then this is really important. Do you feel pressured? Because if you feel pressured, you have to go back. You have to go back a couple steps and kind of start again.
Is this pressured by the person that's doing the thing with you? Mm-hmm. Okay, so in this case, by your healthcare provider? Or
could be. Mm-hmm. Okay, or it could be your partner.
Could be your partner. Okay.
For example, the home birth conversation that we talked about earlier. I want to have a home birth, but my partner doesn't want to.
Exactly.
So here you need to identify how they can support you.
Okay.
And so this is tricky because if it's your provider, sometimes that's a relationship. If it's your partner, it's a relationship dynamic.
Yes.
If it's your provider, you can go say, I actually need some more research about this. And you can ask them for that.
So it might depend on which person we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. And here's that question that you brought up earlier. Which role would you prefer to have in making this decision? I want to share my decision making with blank, like my partner or my provider. Could be either way. I want to decide myself after consulting with whoever, my provider usually or whatever, or someone else decides. So you can absolutely defer the decision making here. I would hope our clients would not choose that very often.
Yes, that would be interesting.
Yeah. So then there's an assessment of what do you need in order to make this decision? So do you know the benefits and risks of each option? Do you feel really comfortable at this point? Yes or no? Are you clear about which benefits and risks matter most to you?
Yes.
So that's a really important thing, just like the antibiotic conversation that we had. The benefit or the risk of getting antibiotics is probably altering the microbiome. The risk of not getting the antibiotic is the baby getting sick.
Yeah.
And possibly dying.
Yes.
Back to the dead baby card.
Right. Speaking of the dead baby card.
No fun.
So that goes also back into your personal beliefs and value system.
And how I perceive risk might be different than how you perceive risk.
Right.
So once I had a client who actually it was the GBS issue. And she, the risks to the baby are about 1 in 200 babies will get sick if you are GBS positive and you don't get antibiotics in labor. She said to me, my sister had a stillbirth and the odds of that were 1 in 200. So 1 in 200 sounds really real to me. And she chose to get the antibiotics.
Yeah, right.
So, 1 in 200 sounds different to different people. So where do you fall on that value system?
Yes, that's good. I like that.
Do you have enough support and advice to make a choice? Yes or no? Do you feel sure about the best choice? If the answer is no, you have to go back.
You have to go back and review. Oh,
Keep doing more research and talking to your support people. And so if the answer is no, you have to decide, is it the background information you're not sure about? Is it what's important to you that you're not sure about? Is it the support that you're not getting that you need? And then finally, you just keep doing that until you feel sure about your decision.
That's great.
Yeah. So it's just a process to follow in order to make an important decision.
I love it. And, this is, it's so interesting to me because I have had the unfortunate job of being the support person for aging parents, sick parents.
This is not just about
this and how my mind is applying what we're talking about to what I've experienced in those situations. I can tell you there's still a whole lot of paternalistic medicine out there.
And aging parents is a particularly challenging issue because autonomy is not as clear-cut when somebody isn't necessarily capable of making their own decisions. Yeah, so I've personally witnessed children too.
Yeah, and it's very similar to children. These adult people are. I've seen them treated like children lots of times, and it's not everybody, of course, but it is. Yeah, it's really hard to figure out where the lines are.
Yeah, and so as parents, as your children grow and as they have their own health issues and things come up, a broken arm, we can splint it or we can cast it. There's just a million opportunities that you're going to be able to use this model as a parent and as a child of aging parents and as a friend and a family member. Really, it's such a great framework to use to make these hard decisions.
That's good. It's going to be very useful.
And so on our podcast, we're going to go through a number of the issues that you might be faced with as a midwifery client. I think we're going to talk about ultrasound. We're going to talk about vitamin K. We're going to talk about a lot of things.
So you're talking about, we're going to start a series
here. Basically.
I think it's there's so many topics that this will apply to, and I think that's great. We'll talk about lots of things.
Yeah, so here's our foundation, and keep tuning in to find out what issues we're going to cover.
Yes.
You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Metro Midwifery. You can find us on the web at modmidwives.com. You can also find us at metromidwifery.com.
Yes.
So kind of lots of ways to find us, and we hope that you'll subscribe and tune in again next week.
All right.
Thanks so much. Bye.